I was not the kind of person things happened to. That is not self-pity. It is a professional description. I spent 12 years as a bonded freight broker on Deccan 4 Transit Hub, and the entire trade rests on people like me. People who do not get involved, who process the paperwork, who verify the seals, who sign the manifests and collect their clearance fees and go home to their bunk modules without acquiring any attachments they did not arrive with. The station ran on that principle. 3 full jurisdictions overlapped at Deccan 4. The hegemony's outer mercantile zone, the Velhari reaches before anyone called them that, and a thin sovereign corridor belonging to a species called the Durath who had been arguing about their border claims since before my grandmother was born. Nothing ever got resolved in a place like that. Things simply got brokered. You learned not to hold opinions. You learned to see the cargo and not the contents. I was good at it, better than good. I had the highest clearance rate of any independent broker on the hub, 2 years running, and that meant I had seen things come through those warehouse doors that I had chosen not to see. Animals in transit stasis that should have had welfare documentation and didn't. Chemical feedstocks whose final destination filings didn't survive close scrutiny. Labor contracts. That was the polite word the hegemony used that a person with any legal background whatsoever would have described differently. I saw them, I checked the stamps, I verified the jurisdictional exemptions, and I signed. Not because I didn't know, because knowing was not part of my job, and Deccan 4 was not the kind of station where you built a career on knowing. I want to be honest about that. I want to say it plainly before I say anything else, because what happened later is not meaningful unless you understand what I was before it. I opened Bay 17 at 4:40 in the morning on a transit layover that should have been routine. My shift didn't start until 6, but a consolidated pallet had come in on the Orvith corridor fast freight 18 hours ahead of its declared schedule, and the auto sorter had flagged it for a manual seal check, because one of the outer clasps had taken impact damage during dock, not catastrophic, not a breach, but enough to kick the pallet to my queue. If I didn't clear it before the 6 o'clock manifest window, the whole consignment would miss its connecting transfer, and I'd be processing reroute claims until midnight. So I went in early. I put on my thermal vest and my work gloves, and I pulled up the pallet record on my tablet, and I walked into Bay 17 with a seal check wand in my hand and nothing on my mind. The bay smelled like cold metal and recycled air, the way it always did. Overhead panels on their pre-dawn cycle, half power, casting that flat blue-gray light that turns everything into the inside of a freezer. The pallet was sitting where the dock arm had left it, a gray composite cube, 2 meters on a side, stacked transit stamps along the top rail. Standard Orvith corridor provenance. Contents listed as industrial filtration components packed dense, no special handling. I ran the wand along the seal line. The 3 intact clasps read clean. The damaged clasp on the outer left corner had stress fractures through the housing, but the seal itself hadn't failed. I could see the hermetic bead was still continuous. Whatever was inside was still inside. I was going to mark it provisionally cleared, flag the damaged clasp for the consignee's attention, and go get coffee. Then I heard the breathing. It was barely there. A small, shallow, controlled effort, the kind of breathing a creature makes when it has learned, been taught. I later understood that breathing quietly is a survival skill. It was coming from inside the pallet, not from a stasis unit. Not from any kind of life support housing. Just from inside the composite casing itself, from somewhere in the space between the listed filtration components. I stood there for a long moment. I had a tablet in one hand and a wand in the other, and a form on my screen that needed one more tick to clear the pallet to its connecting transfer. I was aware of exactly what that breathing meant. I was aware that the responsible, professional thing, the thing that did not acquire entanglements, was to flag the pallet for a customs biological check, step outside the bay, and let the jurisdictional machinery handle whatever was in there. I was also aware, with a clarity that surprised me, that a customs biological check on Deccan 4 at 4:40 in the morning meant 2 hegemony port officers and a Durath exemption clerk who would be on the clock in 6 hours, and that by the time anyone with actual authority arrived, the pallet's connecting transfer window would have opened and closed, and the consignment, all of it, including the breathing, would have resumed its journey to wherever it was going. I put the wand in my vest pocket. I put the tablet under my arm. I found the manual release on the pallet's inspection panel. Every pallet has one for exactly this kind of damage assessment scenario, and I cracked the casing. She was in a hollow at the center of the filtration components, which had been packed around her deliberately, with what I can only describe as care. Someone had made her a nest. There was a folded thermal sheet underneath her, the cheap reflective kind you buy from dispensers in emergency corridors, and she was lying on it with her knees drawn up and her arms folded across her chest and her eyes wide open, looking at me. She was small. She was the smallest person I had ever seen outside of an infant ward, though she was clearly not an infant. Her face had a watchfulness to it that infants don't have, a comprehension. Her skin was silver white, the color of old frost on metal, and it had a very faint structural iridescence that shifted when the baize overhead panels caught it, the way a soap film shifts color when you tilt it. Her ears were feather-tipped. I didn't know what else to call it. Fine filaments at the upper edge, like the fringe on certain birds' wing feathers, pale silver, lying flat against her head because she was tense. Her eyes were amber, dark amber, and they were very large, and they were tracking me with complete attention. She did not make a sound. She did not move. She watched me the way a creature watches something it has decided provisionally not to run from. I said quietly, "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond. Either she didn't understand standard hegemony, or she understood it perfectly and had long since decided that announcements of that kind were not reliable data. I crouched down. I put the tablet on the floor. I kept my hands visible, which is a thing you do for animals and small children and anyone who has reason to be frightened of the size of you. I said, "Are you hurt?" She looked at my hands, then she looked at my face. Then so slowly it was barely movement, she shook her head. The quality of my relief surprised me. I hadn't realized I was holding tension in my chest until it released. I said, "Are you hungry?" She didn't shake her head that time. She just kept looking at me, and there was something in the amber eyes that shifted, not desperation, not pleading, but something more controlled and more painful than either, which was a child who has learned not to ask. I had a ration bar in my vest pocket. I always carry one for long, early morning checks. I took it out and set it on the floor between us and pushed it gently toward her, and then I sat back on my heels and waited. She looked at the ration bar. She looked at me. She looked at the ration bar again. Then she reached out one small silver hand slowly, watching my face the whole time, and picked it up. She ate it in the careful, unhurried way of a person, eating something they are not sure will be followed by more. When she finished, she folded the wrapper precisely into a small rectangle and held it in her hand and looked at me. I said, "My name is Marin. What's yours?" A pause. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, and in an accent I had never heard, a softness on the consonants, a slight tonal rise at the end of words, she said, "Velhari." I did not know then that Velhari was not a name. Or rather, I did not know that it was also a name that a child from the reaches between the Orvith corridor and the hegemony's outer zone might use for herself the way a human child names herself after something she loves, the way children everywhere take the word for their whole world and make it theirs. I did not know any of that. I just heard a child tell me her name, and I said, "Hello, Velhari." She looked at me for another long moment. Then she said, very carefully, "Hello." That was the moment. I know that now. Not later, not when I made the decision not to file the report, Not when I pulled her out of that pallet and carried her back to my bunk module and fed her a second ration bar and a protein pack, and watched her sleep on my bunk with the thermal sheet from the pallet still wrapped around her shoulders. The moment was when she said hello back. Because a child who says hello to you is a child who has decided, with whatever small calculus she has available to her, that you are probably safe. And a child who decides you are probably safe, after everything a child in a sealed cargo pallet has already survived on her way to wherever she was going, is a child you do not put back in the system. I knew what I was doing. I want to be clear about that too. I was not naive. I was not acting on impulse. I sat in my bunk module for an hour while Velhari slept, and I thought it through with the same methodical care I brought to a complicated transit claim. And at the end of that hour, I knew exactly what I was doing and what it was going to cost me, and I did it anyway. I filed the seal check report on the pallet. Damaged clasp, seal integrity maintained, contents verified as listed, industrial filtration components. I cleared it. I did not mention the hollow at the center. I did not mention the thermal sheet. I did not mention the ration bar wrapper, which was still in my pocket, folded into a precise little rectangle that I couldn't bring myself to throw away. The pallet went to its connecting transfer that afternoon. Whatever the threshers had been expecting to find at the other end of it, they found filtration components. Those first 3 days in my bunk module were strange. And I say that as a person who had made her peace with strange years ago. My space was a single occupancy unit, standard transit hub allocation, bunk, desk, a sanitation cabinet barely wide enough to turn around in, a small porthole that faced the station's interior transit ring. I had lived in it for 4 years. It had exactly the number of possessions I needed and no others. It had not been arranged for company. Velhari adapted to it without complaint. That was one of the first things I understood about her. She did not complain about conditions. She assessed them. She identified where things were kept and how they worked and what she was and was not supposed to touch. And she proceeded from that assessment with a quiet efficiency that was striking in a child, and that I recognized, eventually, as what happens to a child who has spent 11 weeks in cargo pallets, who has learned that comfort is a thing you make from whatever is available, not a thing you are given. She was not entirely without preference, though. I discovered on the first evening that she disliked the bunk's overhead light at full strength. It made her blink and pull back slightly, in a way that suggested her vision was calibrated for a dimmer environment, perhaps the Silver Country's light conditions. I didn't know. I dialed it down to 60% and she relaxed, and after that she always reached up and adjusted it herself when she came back into the space, with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone making a small correction that has already been established as acceptable. She slept more than I expected, long, deep cycles, often 12 hours, sometimes more. I didn't know if that was exhaustion or recovery or simply how her biology operated. But I was careful not to disturb those cycles, and I shifted my own schedule to accommodate them, working at my desk in the dimmed light while she slept and moving quietly when I needed to leave or return. She ate steadily and without apparent pleasure, the way you eat when you are making sure you are fueled rather than because food is enjoyable. On the second day, I went to the station's provisioning vendor and bought things I had never bought before, 2 kinds of protein concentrate, a grain block in a flavor I did not recognize, a vitamin compound packet that the vendor said was formulated for multi-species use. I did not know what a child from the Silver Country needed nutritionally, and I could not look it up without creating a search record that I did not want to exist. I bought variety and hoped for coverage, and I watched what she ate and what she left and adjusted accordingly. She watched me work. Not intrusively, she sat on the bunk with her feet tucked under her and the thermal sheet pulled around her shoulders, and she watched me review manifest files and arbitration records with the attentive stillness of a person who is very good at being present without creating obligation. Occasionally she would look away at the porthole, where the transit ring's traffic was visible in the middle distance, cargo movers, personnel shuttles, the slow drift of a bulk carrier approaching its dock berth, and her expression when she watched the ships was something I thought about afterward, in quieter moments. It was not longing exactly. It was more like recognition, the look of someone watching a world they know very well from the inside. I did not ask questions I didn't need the answers to yet. I had the immediate legal situation to build, and I had learned, as a broker, that a person who is still regulating their own nervous system after a significant ordeal will give you better information when they are ready than when they are pressured. I waited. I made sure there was food at the desk and warmth in the bunk and a locked door between her and the station, and I worked. I learned the word threshers 3 days later when they came to my office. There were 2 of them. That was one of the things you learned about the threshers eventually. They always sent 2, because 2 was enough to establish legal standing in a hegemony-adjacent jurisdiction, and not so many as to create the appearance of a raid, which might attract the kind of attention that complicated their exemption filings. They were Drenathi, which is a species I had processed cargo for dozens of times, tall, bilateral, long-limbed, with a brow structure that casts their upper face in permanent shadow. They wore the dark green transit agent credentials of a bonded labor procurement firm, registered in the hegemony's outer mercantile zone, and they were polite in the way that people are polite when they have paperwork that says they don't have to be. The taller one, I never learned their names and I am not going to assign them any, set a claim document on my desk and said, "We're looking for a consignment that was misrouted from the Orvith Corridor Fast Freight, manifest number 47-9. 1 unit of registered contract labor, subclass developmental, in approved transit housing. You processed that pallet." "I did," I said. "Filtration components cleared and forwarded." The consignment we're looking for was inside that pallet. I looked at the claim document. It was genuine. I had seen documents like it before, labor procurement claims that existed in the gap between what the hegemony's outer zone statutes technically prohibited and what a Durath jurisdictional corridor technically permitted. They were structured very carefully. They did not use words like child or minor or involuntary. They used words like developmental, transit stage, and forward scheduled contract. The paperwork was as real as any paperwork I had ever cleared. I said there was nothing in that pallet but filtration components. The shorter one said, "We have a biological marker trace from Bay 17's environmental sensors. The trace is consistent with an unhoused organic on station for approximately 72 hours. They had better equipment than I expected." I filed that away. I said, "Bay 17 processes live cargo transits twice a week. I'm sure you can find biological marker traces from any number of consignments in those logs." The taller one looked at me for a moment. They were assessing me. I was used to being assessed. I kept my hands flat on my desk and my expression professionally neutral, and I waited them out. "We'll be filing a locate and recover claim under Hegemony Outer Zone Code 14B, they said. "Your cooperation would be noted favorably." "I'm sure it would," I said. "I look forward to reviewing the filing when it arrives through official channels." They left. I sat at my desk for 40 seconds after the door closed. Then I went to my bunk module, where Velhari was sitting on my bunk eating crackers from a ration packet and watching a cargo schematic on my tablet, because it was the only thing on the screen she had found she could navigate. She looked up when I came in. She had learned, in 3 days, the difference between my "I have work" expression and my "something is wrong" expression, and she was reading this one accurately. I sat down across from her and said, "Some people are looking for you." She went very still. The feathery tips of her ears flattened against her head. "I'm not going to let them find you," I said, "but I need to know some things, and I need you to tell me as much as you can. Can you do that?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then she set down the crackers with a precision that broke something in me quietly, because it was the gesture of a child being careful with resources, not wasteful, not ever wasteful, and she nodded. What she told me over the next hour came in pieces, in her accented near standard, and a few words I had to work out from context, and it was both worse and more complicated than I had assumed. She was not from the Velhari reaches, or not originally. She was from a settlement at the edge of what she called the Silver Country. I eventually understood she meant a region of her homeworld characterized by silicate mineral deposits, which gave the local population their characteristic skin coloration. The threshers, she didn't call them that. She used a word in her own language that I later had translated, and which means, approximately, the ones who clear, had come to her settlement 7 months ago with labor procurement contracts and hegemony outer zone exemptions, and had taken, as she put it with a flatness that was not emotionlessness, but rather a child's way of protecting herself from a thing she had already had to describe too many times, almost everyone. She had not been taken in the initial procurement. She was small, even by the standards of her own people, and the threshers' forward-scheduled contracts were priced by projected labor yield, and she had not met the threshold. She had hidden in the settlement for 6 weeks with 2 others who also hadn't met the threshold, surviving on stored food and their collective knowledge of how to stay quiet. Then one of the 2 had made contact with someone. She was not clear on who, and I believe she was genuinely unsure, who provided the pallet arrangement as a way out of the settlement and toward what she understood as the reach stations, where her people had a diaspora community and where someone might know what had happened to the ones who had been taken. She had been in transit for 11 weeks, 4 different pallets, 3 station transfers, 2 weeks in a holding space above a vent junction in a Durath border station where someone fed her through a duct. She had survived all of it. She was 9 years old. I know how it sounds when I say I wasn't emotional about it. It sounds like I'm protecting myself from looking cold. But what I mean is something different. I was not emotional the way you are emotional when something is happening to someone else. I was emotional the way you are when something is happening to you. And the thing that was happening to me was that I was sitting across from a 9-year-old child who had survived 11 weeks in cargo pallets and was looking at me with those careful amber eyes, and I had already decided in Bay 17 that she was mine to protect. The emotion was not pity. The emotion was the cold, focused, physical sensation of a person who has just picked up a responsibility and is now assessing the weight of it. That night after she slept, I sat at my desk with the claim document the threshers had left, and I read it the way I read difficult manifests, slowly, looking for the load-bearing point. Every legal architecture has one, the place where it all connects, where if you find the right pivot the whole structure can be questioned. The threshers were operating with serious jurisdictional coverage. That was clear, but serious coverage in a 3-jurisdiction overlap is not the same as airtight coverage. Nothing was airtight in a 3-jurisdiction overlap. The whole system was 3 different governments' ideas of what ought to be true, running simultaneously and never quite matching. Gaps were everywhere. The question was only whether any of the gaps were load-bearing ones. I started pulling the legal archive at 2 in the morning, and I worked through to the pre-shift hours, and that was when I found Article 19. The threshers filed their locate and recover claim the following morning. I was served the notice through my broker registration, which meant they had my credentials and were treating me as an interested party. The claim was thorough. It cited biological environmental data from Bay 17, my clearance signature on the manifest, and a statement from the Orvith corridor carrier that the pallet had been boarded and searched at its destination, and found to contain only filtration components, which was described as evidence of consignment interference by a bonded third party, namely me. Consignment interference under hegemony outer zone code was a serious thing. It could pull my broker license. It could result in financial penalties I could not pay. It could, in the specific jurisdictional configuration of Deccan 4 result in a Durath detention order while the claim was arbitrated, which could take months. I read the claim twice. Then I read it a third time more slowly, the way I read complicated manifests when I'm looking for the place where the paperwork is weaker than it appears. And I found it. I found several of them. Here is what 12 years of bonded freight brokerage gives you: an intimate, practical knowledge of the gaps in jurisdictional architecture. Not the gaps that are accidents, those get closed. The gaps that are deliberate, installed by people who need them for their own purposes, and who have therefore made sure they are load-bearing. The thresher's operation depended on a specific stack of overlapping exemptions: the Hegemony Outer Zone Labor Procurement Code, the Durath Border Corridors Non-Interference Statutes, and a bilateral transit agreement between the two jurisdictions that predated the current political configuration by about 30 years and had never been updated. Their claim against me was filed under the hegemony layer of that stack. What I knew, and what I was reasonably certain they did not know I knew, was that the bilateral transit agreement had a clause, Article 19, subsection 4, that predated the Labor Procurement Code entirely, that had been installed at the request of a Durath faction that no longer existed, and that in its original language established that any biological entity of non-hegemony origin found without documentation in a bonded hegemony transit space was to be treated as a ward of the transit authority pending resolution of species of origin determination, not as a consignment item. The thresher's claim against me required that Velhari be legally classifiable as a consignment item at the time of the alleged interference. Article 19, subsection 4 was an older statute than the Labor Procurement Code. In a three-jurisdiction overlap, older statutes had precedence when they conflicted with newer ones, unless superseded, and Article 19, subsection 4 had never been superseded, because the faction that had installed it had dissolved before it had time to revise it, and no one since had had any reason to touch it. It was a small gap, it was load-bearing, and it was mine. I spent the next 36 hours building the counterfiling. I did not sleep. I ate ration bars at my desk and drank cold coffee, and I went through every public record jurisdictional archive I had access to. And a broker on Deccan 4 had access to quite a lot, pulling the legal history of Article 19, the bilateral agreement's ratification records, the supersession logs, the arbitration precedents that had cited it in the past 40 years. There were 3 precedents that had cited it directly, none of them involving labor procurement, all of them involving disputed classification of non-hegemony biological material in transit. That was fine. Precedents didn't have to be identical to be applicable. They had to establish that the statute was active and interpretable. Velhari sat with me for parts of those 36 hours and slept through others. She didn't ask what I was doing. After the first 12 hours, she began bringing me crackers when she thought I had been sitting still too long, setting them at my elbow with a quiet deliberateness that made me understand that she had been taking care of people before she ended up in a cargo pallet, and that taking care was, for her, a way of being in the world. I ate the crackers. I kept working. At the end of the 36 hours, I had a counterfiling that was 62 pages long and cited 11 distinct legal instruments, 3 arbitration precedents, and 1 historical amendment to the bilateral transit agreement that the thresher's lawyers, I was reasonably sure, had never read because the amendment was filed under a Durath bureaucratic classification that didn't appear in the standard legal databases. It was in the Physical Archive Annex of the Durath Border Authority's station office, where I had physically gone at 3 in the morning to retrieve it, because I had once processed a complicated Durath customs claim and had learned in the process that their archive indexing was not fully digitized. I filed the counterclaim. I filed it simultaneously with the Hegemony Transit Arbitration Body, the Durath Border Authority, and the Deccan 4 Station Authority, so that all three jurisdictions were on record as having received it at the same timestamp. That mattered. It meant no single jurisdiction could quietly route it to a more convenient outcome. Then I went to my bunk module, and I slept for 6 hours. The Thresher's lawyers responded in 4 days. Their response was what I expected. They challenged the applicability of Article 19, argued that the Labor Procurement Code's later ratification superseded it, and added a new element I had been waiting for, which was a claim that Velhari's documentation, which the Threshers held, established her classification as a forward-contracted labor unit under Hegemony Outer Zone statute prior to her being found in my care, and that therefore she could not be reclassified as a non-documented ward regardless of what Article 19 said. That was the real fight, the documentation. I knew what those documents were. I had seen the type before in other manifests, and I had signed off on them before, and I was not going to be able to say in any arbitration proceeding that I hadn't known what they were. That was going to be a problem for me personally later. It was not the immediate problem. The immediate problem was that Velhari's documentation existed, and I needed to contest its validity without access to the documents themselves, because I could not file a subpoena for them without revealing that I was in contact with the subject of the claim, which would expose her location and trigger the locate and recover protocol. I sat with that problem for 2 days. I went back through the Labor Procurement Code, looking for the validation requirements. What made a forward contract document legally sufficient? And I found something that I should have found sooner, that I had not found sooner because I had been looking at the jurisdictional architecture and not at the document standards themselves. The Hegemony's Outer Zone Labor Procurement Code, under the pressure of repeated challenges from humanitarian advocacy filings over the previous decade, had been quietly amended to require that all forward contracted labor documentation include an independent biological assessment from a licensed Hegemony medical examiner confirming the subject's capacity for the contracted labor category. The amendment was 5 years old. It was not obscure. It was in the main body of the code, but it was buried in a subsection about documentation completeness standards that most people's eyes slid past because it was administrative rather than substantive. The Threshers' contracts had been executed 7 months ago in a settlement on the edge of a region that did not have a licensed Hegemony medical examiner within 100 light years. There was no way those contracts had a compliant biological assessment attached. They couldn't have one, which meant every document in their package was invalid under the code that was supposed to authorize it. I filed a documentation completeness challenge, 47 pages. Cited the amendment, the geographic impossibility of compliance, and 3 cases in which the Hegemony arbitration body had voided labor contracts on documentation completeness grounds. The Threshers' lawyers went quiet for 9 days. In those 9 days, several things happened. 1. The Threshers sent 2 more people to my office. These were not lawyers. They were larger and they were not carrying credentials, and one of them stood in my doorway and explained, in a voice that was carefully modulated to sound like a conversation, that complications in the legal process could be resolved more efficiently through direct settlement, and that I should think carefully about what I actually wanted out of this situation. I said, "I want you to leave my office." They left. I flagged the visit with the Deccan 4 Station Authority's security office and filed it as a formal record of intimidation by a party to an active arbitration claim. The security officer who took my statement looked at me in a way that suggested he considered this an elaborate waste of everyone's time. I did not care. The record existed. That was what mattered. 2. I had a conversation with Velhari that I had been putting off. I told her what the legal process looked like and approximately how long it might take and what the possible outcomes were. I told her as plainly as I could, in language that I hoped was neither falsely reassuring nor more frightening than the truth. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked, with a precision that I had come to recognize as characteristic of her. She did not ask imprecise questions. If the people looking for me win the legal thing, what happens? They take you, I said. I don't let that happen. She looked at me for a long time. She said, "You are sure?" "Yes," I said. It was the first time I had said anything like that to her without immediately following it with a conditional or a qualification. And I think she noticed, because something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, but a small, careful relaxation. The way a person releases tension in a muscle they have been holding for so long they stopped noticing it. "Okay," she said. "Then what do we do now?" I said, "I keep filing paperwork. You keep eating crackers and not opening the door to anyone." She nodded. She said, "I can do that." 3. I started making contact with people I had avoided making contact with for 12 years. I knew them. Everyone who worked the fringe jurisdictions for long enough knew them, the same way you know which vendors at a market are selling things they'd prefer not to have inspected, not as friends or allies, but as known quantities. People who filed challenges to labor procurement contracts. People who ran documentation completeness cases through the arbitration system on behalf of subjects who couldn't file for themselves. 2 of them were lawyers. One was a retired hegemony customs inspector who had left the service under circumstances she had never explained to my satisfaction. And one was a Durath archivist who worked for the Border Authority and who had, on one occasion, pointed me toward a filing annex that had changed my understanding of the jurisdictional architecture considerably. I am not going to describe those conversations in detail. They are their own record. What came out of them, over the course of those 9 days, was a more complete understanding of the thresher's operation than I had had before, how wide it was, how many settlements it had touched in the outer reaches, how many contracts it had executed, and how many of those contracts were now sitting in legal limbo because of the documentation completeness amendment that the thresher's compliance process had apparently never caught up with. Velhari's case was not isolated. It was a thread that, if I pulled it correctly, did not stop at Velhari. I understood the risk of that. Pulling on the thread meant making the case visible in ways that one person's arbitration filing could not be. It meant drawing attention that would accelerate the pressure on me. It meant that if I lost bigger. I pulled it anyway. The thresher's lawyers filed their response to my documentation completeness challenge on the morning of the 9th day. They had found a workaround, an obscure hegemony provision that allowed documentation gaps to be remediated retroactively if the procuring agent could establish that the documentation deficiency was the result of geographic access limitations beyond the agent's control. It was a real provision. It existed for genuinely remote operations where compliance was impractical. They were abusing it, but the abuse was technically defensible. I read the filing once, then I called the Durath archivist. The Bilateral Transit Agreement's Article 19 had a subclause, not subsection 4, a different one, subsection 7, that I had cataloged and set aside when I first went through the archive, because at the time it hadn't seemed directly applicable. Subsection 7 established that in any jurisdictional dispute involving a biological entity of non-hegemony origin, no retroactive documentation remediation was permissible if the entity in question had already been formally registered as a ward of a transit authority under any applicable statute. Because a hegemony remediation was being applied to a Durath corridor case, and because Article 19 made Velhari a ward of the transit authority the moment I had found her in Bay 17, the retroactive remediation provision did not apply. It was a closing, not a winning argument on its own. Nothing was a winning argument on its own in 3-jurisdiction law, but it was a wall that the thresher's workaround couldn't get through. I filed it with the same simultaneous 3-jurisdiction timestamp as my earlier filing. I attached the full text of subsection 7, the archive retrieval record, and a formal citation chain going back to the bilateral agreement's ratification. The Thresher's lawyers went quiet again, this time for 16 days. In those 16 days, Velhari learned to play a card game. I had a battered physical deck that I had carried since my first posting, which I had learned from a Durath dockworker who had learned it from someone else, and I taught her the rules one evening when I was too tired to read another legal document, and she was watching me with the particular patient look that meant she thought I needed to do something other than work. She picked it up in 3 rounds and beat me in the 4th, not because she was lucky, but because she was paying attention to my tells in a way that suggested she had been studying people's faces for information for a very long time. I said, "You're good at that." She said, "I learned to watch people," a pause, "in the settlement before. You had to know who was going to take the food and who was going to leave it." Another pause, "And later." I didn't ask about later, I dealt the next hand. We played most evenings after that. It became the shape the days had me at the desk during the working hours, her doing whatever she found to occupy herself, which turned out to be more varied than I expected. She asked me, on the 4th day of the 16, whether she could have a piece of paper, and I gave her a pad from my desk supplies, and she spent 2 days making something on it that I eventually understood was a map. Not a map from memory, I thought, but a map she was constructing from what she knew and what she was working out, the station's layout as she understood it from what she could see through the porthole and from listening to the sounds of the traffic, the approximate directions of the transit lanes. She had a spatial intelligence that was striking. When I looked at what she'd made and then looked at my own mental model of the station, hers was more accurate in several respects than mine, and I had lived there for 4 years. She asked careful questions. Not many. She seemed to understand that some things were not safe to ask and others were not my information to give, but the ones she asked were precise. She asked once what language the legal documents were written in, and when I said standard hegemony, she asked if she could read some of them, and I gave her a section of the counterfiling that didn't contain her name or species designation. She read it slowly and without asking for help with vocabulary, which meant her standard was better than she'd let on, or she was too proud to ask, or both. When she handed it back, she said, "The gap, the old law, is it really there?" "It's really there," I said. She nodded once, as if confirming something she had already calculated. "Good," she said. She knew, in other words, what was being built in my filings, even if she didn't know all the pieces. She was 9 years old, and she had been processing the information available to her with the same steady assessment she brought to everything else, and she had concluded that the architecture I was building was real and defensible. I found that more steadying than I expected. A 9-year-old's confidence is not the same as a lawyer's confidence, but in a situation where I had limited access to lawyers, it counted for something. She said once during those 16 days, "Marin, what happens after?" I said, "After what?" "After the legal thing is done." She was looking at the cards in her hand. "If we win." I had been thinking about this for weeks. I had been not quite thinking about it, the way you don't quite think about a thing that you have already decided, but haven't yet said out loud. I said, "I've been talking to some people in the Velhari reaches. There's a community station at Reach 7 that has a significant population from your homeworld region. They have a settlement coordinator who works with people who have been through what you've been through." She looked up from her cards. "If that's what you want," I said, "I'll take you there myself." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked back at her cards. She said, "Is that what you want?" It was not a child's question. It was a question from someone who had been moved through space by other people's decisions for a long time and had learned to ask carefully whether a decision was being made for her benefit or for the decision-maker's convenience. I said, what I want is for you to be somewhere you're safe and where people who know your world can take care of you. I'm a freight broker. That's not the same thing. She considered this. She said, you take care of me. I do, I said, and I will keep doing it until you're somewhere better, but Reach 7 is better. I want you to have better. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, are there people there who know the Silver Country? I had checked this. Some, I said, not many, but some. She nodded once slowly. She laid her cards down. She had won the hand again. The Thresher's lawyers filed their final response on day 17. It was not a concession. It was a reframing of the entire claim into Durath jurisdictional language, which required refiling with the Durath Border Authority and would restart the arbitration clock. It was, in other words, a delay strategy, a way to drag the case out until either I ran out of resources or Velhari was located through other means. I had been expecting something like this. I had, in the 16 days, been preparing for it. What I filed the following morning was not a response to their reframing. It was a separate action, filed directly with the Hegemony Outer Zone Trade Conduct Authority, not the Transit Arbitration Body, a different office, one that handled complaints about bonded labor procurement firms, citing 9 specific contracts from the Thresher's known portfolio, all of which I had obtained through the network of people I had been building contact with for the past 3 weeks, and all of which were deficient under the Documentation Completeness Amendment. 7 of them had been executed in the same geographic region as Velhari's, which made the geographic limitations defense inapplicable even before the retroactive remediation question arose. The action was not about Velhari. It was about the Thresher's operating license. A bonded labor procurement firm under investigation by the Trade Conduct Authority for systematic documentation noncompliance cannot file active locate and recover claims during the investigation period. It is an automatic stay provision, installed to prevent firms under conduct review from taking protected custody of witnesses. It is triggered by the investigation, not by a court finding. The investigation was triggered at 9 o'clock in the morning. By noon, the stay was in effect. By 3 in the afternoon, I had received formal confirmation that the locate and recover claim against me had been suspended pending resolution of the conduct review. The conduct review took 14 months. By the time it concluded, with the Thresher's operating license revoked and 7 of their senior partners facing hegemony fraud charges, Velhari had been at Reach 7 for 11 of those months, and I was back to being a freight broker on Deccan 4, which was considerably more complicated than it had been before, because I had spent 6 weeks burning political capital and professional relationships to get the trade conduct filing done, and some of those relationships were not going to recover. I am not sorry about that. I want to be clear about that. I took Velhari to Reach 7 myself, as I said I would. We took a standard carrier transit, not a fast freight. I had had enough of fast freight for a while, and it was a 3-day journey, and for the first day she sat across from me in the passenger compartment with the thermal sheet from the pallet folded in her lap, watching the transit lanes out the porthole, and neither of us said much. There was a family in the forward compartment, 2 adults and 3 children, different species from Velhari but children of roughly equivalent size, and they were loud the way children who have room to be loud are loud. Not distressed, just present, filling the available space with themselves the way children do when they are safe. Velhari watched them for a while through the open compartment door, not intrusively, just attentively, with the same cataloging expression she brought to cargo schematics and maps and legal documents. After a time, one of the children looked back at her and made a gesture that I assumed was friendly, since Velhari's ears came up a fraction. Just a fraction, the equivalent I had come to understand, of a small smile, and she made a gesture back, and that was the extent of it. I didn't comment. I watched the transit lanes. That evening she asked me about Reach 7, not the questions she'd asked before, The practical ones about community size and what language people spoke, and whether the settlement coordinator would have documentation records that might trace the ones who had been taken. Those questions had already been asked and answered, with as much accuracy as I could provide. These were different questions. She wanted to know what the station itself looked like. Whether it had a garden structure. She had seen it from the approach corridor in my description, and the word had landed somewhere specific in her expression, somewhere careful. Whether people from the Silver Country kept anything of the way the settlement had been. I told her what I knew, which was not enough. I told her the settlement coordinator had described it as a real community, which was not a bureaucratic phrase, which was the specific thing Asha Trell had said, a real community, in a tone that suggested she meant it the way you mean a thing you have seen fail in other places and succeed in this one. I told her the garden structures were real. I had seen them in the approach images, and they looked like something someone had spent time on. I told her I didn't know about the Silver Country specifically, but that diaspora communities generally keep what they can carry, which is a saying I had heard on 3 different stations from 3 different species, and which I believed. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "My mother used to grow things." It was the first time she had mentioned her mother without being asked. I did not push. I said, "What did she grow?" "Things with silver leaves," she said. "Small ones in the window ledge at home, in the good light." I said, "That sounds like something worth growing." She nodded. She turned back to the porthole. On the second day, she asked me to teach her another card game, and I taught her one I'd learned on my first posting that was more complicated and required more patience, and she beat me at it by the 3rd hand. On the 3rd day, as we were coming into the Reach 7 approach corridor, and the station was becoming visible through the porthole, a larger station than I had expected, well lit, with what looked like actual garden structures under the observation dome, she said, "Marin." "Yeah," I said. "The ration bar wrapper," she said. "Do you still have it?" I looked at her. She was watching the station, not me. I reached into my vest pocket. I still had it. I carried it every day without thinking about it, the way you carry things that have no practical use and that you cannot quite bring yourself to dispose of. I held it out. She took it from me and looked at it for a moment. Then she unfolded it very carefully and smoothed it flat and looked at it for another moment. "I kept it too," she said, "in my head, that you set it on the floor and pushed it toward me and then you moved back." "You needed to be able to choose," I said. "Yes," she said, "that is what I kept." She folded the wrapper back up, precisely, into the same rectangle she had always made it, and she held it in both hands as the carrier locked into the approach lane and the station filled the porthole. The settlement coordinator at Reach 7 was a woman named Asha Trell, hegemony registered, mid-50s, with the competent manner of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time without becoming hard. She met us at the docking arm with a younger colleague and a terminal loaded with intake forms, and she looked at Velhari with a professional assessment that shifted, in a moment, into something softer, not pity, which Velhari would have felt and disliked, but recognition. The recognition of a person who has seen this before and knows what it costs and has decided anyway to keep showing up. Velhari looked at her, she looked at me, she reached out and took my hand. I held it. We stood there for a moment in the docking corridor with the station's ambient hum around us, and the porthole showing transit lanes, and the distant glitter of whatever stars were in the Reach 7 sky. Then she let go and turned toward Asha Trell and said, "My name is Velhari. I am from the Silver Country." Her voice was steady. The feathery tips of her ears were upright. I watched them walk down the corridor. Velhari and Asha Trell and the younger colleague, who was talking quietly and pointing toward what I imagined were the common areas, the places where the intake process started, until they turned a corner and were gone. I stood in the docking corridor for a while. I don't know how long. long enough that a maintenance worker came through and asked if I was waiting for something. I said I wasn't. I took the return carrier to Deccan 4 and I went back to work. The Thresher's conduct review ground through its 14 months and came to its conclusion, and I gave one deposition by remote terminal and did not have to appear in person. My broker license was reviewed and reinstated with a formal notation that the consignment interference allegation had been withdrawn. I paid a fine for procedural violations related to the manifest clearance. I had known that was coming, and I had the money set aside, and I filed the payment and put the notation in my records and moved on. I hear from Velhari sometimes, not often. She is in school at Reach 7, a proper school, and she is apparently doing well by every measure that matters. Asha Trell sends me a status note every few months, more than she needs to, which I think is her way of acknowledging what it cost. Once, about 8 months in, I received a message directly from Velhari herself, short, in her careful near standard with the soft consonants, that said, among other things, I am learning to play the complicated card game with the other children here. I am teaching them the tells. She also said in the same message that someone at the community station had found a species of plant with silver-colored leaves that grew in window ledges, and that she had been given one, and that it was doing well in the light. I read that message 3 times, then I filed it in a folder I don't often open. People ask me, sometimes, not many people, but occasionally someone who has heard the broad shape of it through professional circles, whether I would do it again. They mean, knowing the cost, knowing the 6 weeks and the depositions and the fine and the relationships and the license review and the sleep I didn't get, and the cold coffee and the 3 in the morning trips to a physical archive, would you crack that pallet? The answer is so obvious to me that I find the question difficult to engage with seriously. I fed her. That was the moment. Once you feed a child, they're yours to protect. It's not a decision you make after deliberation. It's a thing that's already happened, and all you're doing from that point forward is catching up to it. The Threshers modeled for a lot of things. They had jurisdictional coverage across 3 governance zones. They had lawyers who knew the exemption architecture better than most arbitrators. They had resources and reach, and a 14-year operating history that had never been seriously challenged. What they didn't model for was a freight broker who had spent 12 years learning to see things and sign off on them, who had reached a morning where she couldn't sign off, and who was going to use every piece of that 12 years to make sure this particular child got to use the word that was her name for what it was. The name of a place that was also hers, and a future that nobody was going to file a claim on. I still carry the wrapper. I know it's sentimental. I carry it anyway.